Good evening or afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is John McQuillan. I'm the president of the Bibliographical Society of America. Thank you for joining us tonight. The BSA is pleased to present Tinkering to Learn, Books, Toys, and Other Object Lessons in British Culture with our special guests Elizabeth Massa Hoiem and Laura Wasowicz. Today's event serves two purposes. First is a celebration of scholarly work that has been recognized with one of BSA's major publication awards. Dr. Hoiem received the 2025 Justin G. Schiller Prize for bibliographical work on children's books, which is awarded every 3 years. While the prize was announced in 2025 at our annual meeting, this event is allowing for the larger public to hear directly from the recipient of the award and to learn more about Dr. Hoyem's research and the work being done in the specific field of bibliography. The prize was endowed by renowned bookseller and collector Justin Schiller to encourage scholarship in the bibliography of historical children's literature issued before 1951. The Schiller Prize honors research in bibliography, broadly conceived, and focuses on the material text as historical evidence for studying topics such as the history of the production, distribution, collecting, or reading of children's literature, as well as studies of manuscript production and circulation, printing, publishing, and the allied trades, as these relate to children's literature. The prize will be awarded again in January 2028, with an application period during the spring and summer of 2027. So if you're working in this field or know of those who are, please keep an eye out for the submission, for the call for submissions next year, probably around this date or a little bit before. In addition to being the recipient of the 2025 Schiller Prize, Dr. Elizabeth Massa Hoiem is a past recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Research Fellowship, recipient of the Children's Literature Association's Judith Plotz Emerging Scholar Award for 2019, a 2025 to 26 CCC Natural History Humanities Visiting Fellow at the University of Cambridge, and a finalist for the 2025 Book History Book Prize offered by Sharp, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing, among many other honors. She is Associate Professor in the School of Information Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she teaches courses on literacy and reading cultures. Her scholarship analyzes the rise of playful learning, or instruction and delight, in the context of colonization and child labor, drawing on theoretical and historical perspectives from working class history, history of education, material cultural studies, history of science, and literacy studies. Today is also a special occasion in that we get to celebrate BSA's role in its broad support and recognition of important research in bibliography. This is why today's event is part of BSA's spring fundraiser. If you're inspired by the kind of research into books and book culture that you'll hear about today, please take a moment to donate if you haven't already. And as a special motivation, please make note of two incentives that we are currently running. If you donate at least $125 before the end of today, you'll receive one of our specially commissioned letterpress notebooks, if my camera will focus in on that correctly. And beginning this evening and starting tomorrow through the rest of the month, all donations will go twice as far, thanks to a generous matching fund contribution from the BSA Council. All donations in any amount will be doubled by that match up to $6,000 through May 31st. And links to donate are in the chat currently. And I think as of kind of tonight, you can decide when you donate if you would like a journal or if you would like to be part of the matching grant. Information on how to donate is also found in the confirmation email that you received for this event. As a humanities-focused nonprofit, the BSA's fundraising activities directly support the work of creating community around bookish topics, including free events, scholarships for rare book courses, short-term research fellowships, and high-quality publications. We very much appreciate your support. Joining Liz today will be Laura Wasowicz, who chaired the 2025 Schiller Prize jury. Laura is a historian and curator of children's literature at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Mass. She works directly with research in historic children's literature and builds, cultivates, and promotes the Society's collection of children's materials. Laura will join Liz in a dialogue around some great images from Liz's research for about 30 or 40 minutes, after which I will facilitate the question and answer period. You, at any point, are welcome to ask your questions by clicking the Q&A button on your Zoom window and posting it in there. I will ask both of them the questions after they have finished their dialogue. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to Liz and Laura. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And it's my pleasure to be here. It's not, and I'm very grateful. Thank you, Justin Schiller, for funding this prize and really growing the field of children's literature and how it intersects with bibliography. Thank you very much. All right. So I will now present our friend Liz Hoiem. She won the 2025 Justin G. Schiller Prize, and the book is called The Education of Things. Buy this book. It's thick, it's dense, it's rich, it's wonderful. And The Education of Things, the full title, Mechanical Literacy in British Children's Literature, 1762 to 1860. And it is published by the University of Massachusetts Press. And it is part of, it is part of Childhoods, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Childhood and Youth. And that's a wonderful series that is published by the University of Massachusetts under the wonderful editorial leadership of Rachel Conrad, Alice Hurst, Laura Lovett, and Karen Sanchez-Epler, just a stellar team of editorial expertise. Liz Hoiem's study provides an excellent, in-depth analysis of the technology texts written for children and youth in Britain during the Industrial Revolution. Using children's print culture in the form of books, object lesson kits, and pedagogical ephemera like wall posters, Hoiem deftly charts the development of mechanical learning texts across classes, from child factory workers in Lancasterian monitorial schools to wealthy children engaging in experiments using material found in their very well-appointed mansions. Hoiem puts texts by British middle-class didactic writers like Maria Edgeworth and Isaac Taylor in conversation with working-class advocates, including George Moody and William Hill. The Education of Things breaks new ground in our understanding of the relationships between academic scientific theory, practical technological knowledge, class, and gender in the rising British Empire. It's just a tour de force. When she cuts across class, gender, race, it's all there, and with beautiful, beautiful illustrations of primary source materials. The publication of The Education of Things comes at a time of heated debate over the appropriate role of technological education in current school curriculums. Now, Liz, I noticed that you began your book with a description of the graduate students' struggle at your alma mater, the University of Illinois, to be recognized as instructors as opposed to teacher trainees. The crux of the matter was a contested distinction between what is learning and what is work. Could you discuss further how this situation inspired you to examine the creation and execution of technological education in 18th and 19th century Great Britain?
Sure. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everybody, for inviting me to be here today. And to Justin Schiller for the prize that you've set up to support people, because it really does make a difference to the field as a whole. So thank you. And yeah, so this started when I was a graduate student. I think my way of considering the relationship, this fuzzy relationship between play, work, and education came from my own experience as a graduate student, where at my university and in a lot of other universities across the United States, we had to seek permission in order to unionize and prove that what we were doing as graduate students actually was work and didn't count as just an educational opportunity to support our professional development. And this kind of thing was something that I was also uncovering or sort of reading about in labor laws that were affecting children at the time, because there were many children's positions were kind of liminally defined as apprenticeships. And so whether they could be paid, whether they could leave their jobs, these things were being decided by parliamentary debate. And then that status of apprenticeship was also used as a kind of false lie about what happened when slavery was ended in the British West Indies, so in the Caribbean islands, that Britain had claimed. So during the 1930s, when British Parliament ended enslavement there, they instead had this like so-called apprenticeship program, which was just using that word for the continued enslavement and forced labor of people. And then people locally in different places pushed back using strikes and labor movements to insist that actually they would need to get paid, and it wasn't educational to just continue doing the same sort of work as you were doing before. So this idea that apprenticeship is actually can be this thing that is stamped on work as a way of avoiding to pay you was something that it can cut across so many different contexts. So that's really what got me thinking about this.
Yes. Oh, and it really continues on to this day. When I began at the American Antiquarian Society, there were internships that were given to library school students, but I think most of them were unpaid. Now that has changed and they are paid. So, but that's over a period of, say, the last 30 plus years. So even that has evolved. Our own founder, Isaiah Thomas, who was the great 18th century printer and colleague of Benjamin Franklin's, he started out as an apprentice at about the age of 6, 7, 8. And that's how he learned his trade. He learned how to read literally backwards and sideways by composing type. Yeah, just composing text on a composing stick. It's upside down and backwards, so that he would gain his literacy in that way is really amazing. But his own case of being apprenticed because he was poor and his father deserted the family and his mother had no way of supporting the family, that is in and of itself sadly, a very common story at that time. But back to your text. Your book examines widely available printed literature for children between the 1760s and the enactment of the Universal Primary School Law in 1870 in Britain. The organization of your book is thematic as opposed to chronological. You start with the literary, looking at the literacy skills of reading and writing, and then you end up with another literacy skill, grammar. So it sort of comes full circle on the face of it. Why did you choose a thematic organization, and how did you choose those themes?
Okay, yeah. So this was really tough, actually, when I was figuring out how to organize my material, because I just had a lot of it. I just looked at as much stuff as I could. I knew that overall I wanted to show this relationship between the way that people thought of the mind, not necessarily entirely materialistically, but as a kind of container that organized things and had an active component to it. It wasn't necessarily an idea of like passive filling you up with information, but that your mind acted on things and organized information inside of it in a way that was analogous to a book, to a library, and to the world itself that you're reading. And so I really wanted to draw together philosophy of mind and educational philosophy of the time with studies of the book as a material object, or sort of our understanding of the book and how you can manipulate it, with then also objects that can be organized. So when I was bringing together all these materials and sort of seeing this across like 100 years, it became really quite difficult to figure out how to draw this out when it didn't really make sense in the traditional literary way to go in like a literary historicist argument to sort of start in one point and go through, for a number of different reasons, one of which may appeal to the Bibliographical Society in particular, because a lot of these books are reprinted and adapted. And so when I would talk about a particular book, a lot of times I might be dealing with 30, 40 years of reprints and adaptations of it and kind of checking through them to see like, what is this book, you know? And then when did this group of books become popular? And so what I ended up trying to do instead was kind of split the difference. So, you know, because I didn't want to be talking about a book as if it just appeared in 1810. It could have been pulled in and even republished under a different title 60 years later. There was a lot of reuse in nonfiction literature in particular. So what I ended up doing was kind of walking through, and actually I do have, so I have a lot of slides that I prepped, and I can bring this up for those of you who are unfamiliar with the structure of it.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Show
so
us
this
some
has
slides.
Okay, so if everybody can see that, this is my just overview of what the chapters are. So you can see, so what I did is I kind of started with a kind of theoretical chapter. So in a way, I said it was thematic because I was like, I just want people to be prepared that this is not exactly chronological, even though it is a little bit. It starts with the earliest materials and it ends with the later materials, but it's big chunks of overlapping time. So this lays out the sort of like 18th century material philosophy of mind that sets off this kind of study, and then also theorizes how children are supposed to reach out into the world, observe the world, manipulate their books in similar sorts of ways, and then organize their own interior mind. So it kind of theorizes how books work in that way. And then the second part is about physics books. How do people learn the physical sciences? Because my idea was that if you really want to understand the book as a material object, you should understand that materiality as people of the day did. Like what did they learn about physics? What was matter to them? So this was also in a bit inspired by like the way that thing theory tends to look towards physics to kind of understand things, but very often modern physics, like 20th century. And I wanted to go back to sort of 18th and 19th century physics, see what those books portray. And one of the things I realized is that there's mechanical philosophy, which is usually seen as like a subset of what we would call physics or physical sciences, or there's actually two different kinds of knowledge. One is considered the kind of knowledge of mechanics, how you make stuff, and it's very practical and applied. And then the other is the philosophical principles like Newton's laws, or understanding of these kinds of principles that govern the universe in a mathematical way. So I wanted to look at the way that class divide in labor was then structuring how people thought about your understanding of the material world. So these are the opening theoretical chapters, even though they're very much like grounded in just objects from the archive that I saw. And they're not abstract theories in any sort of way. And then I leaned into like books about political economy and manufacturing. And then the next piece with Mariah Edgeworth, who really publishes over a long period of time on children and is reprinted for a long period of time. I was interested in kind of doing a deep dive into an author because I don't get a chance to do a deep dive anywhere else. And she was really so central to my thinking about this, and to many other people who are writing nonfiction and science at the time refer to Edgeworth as like, I'm trying to write like Edgeworth. She's really the person that they all identify as their common, I guess, exemplary source of what they're trying to do as nonfiction science writers. So I wrote about her fiction and her fascination with automata. So like clockwork, mimetic humans or mimetic animals and creatures that move on their own. And how that kind of regulation was part of her understanding of what a well-regulated child should become as they grow up and can sort of control themselves or be the directors of their own machinery. And then the last chapter is like the working class response to all of this. And this was really hard to figure out, like, what could I find that would offer a coherent engagement with that? Because of course, not all authors who are immersed in working class culture are necessarily that concerned with the pedagogical theories being used in sort of like more wealthy nursery and school contexts. But there was actually a sort of overlap, particular among sort of Chartist cooperative journalists. So people who are part of the cooperative movement, because all of Robert Owen, who is sort of the leader of that movement, all of his teachers were trained in Pestalozzian theory. This is like this German educator, like he sent his teachers and his son overseas to train, and he was an advocate of this. And this was part of the way that people were designing schools at the time to help people study the world around them. So I wanted to see how that how were people aware of that, and what were they writing back to it? What was the working class cultural idea of object learning? So that was my full organization, if that makes sense. So it kind of follows through, and then it ends with this sort of pushing back or resistance. So you're able to see a contrary argument. I felt like that was really important, because otherwise my claims that much of this represents a theory of property ownership and class are kind of empty unless somebody else is like, yeah, when we see it and we don't like it. So this is an important piece of, I think, convincing people that it's there, because people could see this was there.
And I really like that about the book, because it's generally so many studies they'll focus on a writer like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Maria Edgeworth, Godwin. I mean, it's and they're just like kind of siloed, and there's no. But you really put these figures in conversation. Well, what was their motivation? What was the pushback to what they were trying to do? And as an Americanist, I can tell you that we have a huge collection of Maria Edgeworth. Oh my! And I catalog most of it. And to me, especially when I first started working with her, to me it was just fascinating. That the learned the learned aunt is instructing the children, and they're both boys and girls, and they're doing scientific experiments. So it's very feminized, at least in this context. And the other thing I thought was, well, this family, they had the space and the money, that's because they didn't have to send their kids to work, and these children had the leisure to learn in that environment. And that's what I kept. That's the loop that was kept playing in my mind while I was reading your descriptions, especially of Maria Edgeworth's work. To go back to early on in your text, you write, the flexibility of how we interpret these activities, practical education, scientific education, as essentially education or work, has its origins in the historical period of hands-on learning, and when it first became a pedagogical approach. And you talk about that within this time period, in the long 18th into the latter half of the 19th century, some types of mechanical education were celebrated and others were discredited. So could you give some examples of that?
Yeah, so what I'm getting at here is that very often, I think this is something we're really familiar with now, because we see it all the time, but very often the sort of more theoretical or well-paid work that we do as experts relies on knowledge that we get from other people who are much closer to the ground. So this is what I was trying to describe occurring there. And the term that I use for this, mechanical literacy, is like understanding the laws governing the world. In a way, that kind of like high level understanding is, I think, what the sort of more privileged children are trying to acquire and learn, because it's given more prestige. But to learn that, they're reliant on just watching regular people do their jobs very often, and then theorizing what they're watching. And so I was very curious about the way that play, something that we normally think about as just a really fun way to learn and how it's liberating and everything, that's a kind of privileged position that goes along with a kind of surveillance ability that these kids have. They play, they watch, they imitate. That's how they work. Because they don't have to work. So the way that they're getting access to the kind of hands-on knowledge that is actually comes about from doing a job is by watching it and imitating it in play. And so to give you like a modern example, I was talking to one of my colleagues about this, Brandon Batzloff, and they pointed out, like, because I was saying, what are some examples of this that you've seen? Because they also work with expertise. And they mentioned that, like, immigrant farm workers, for instance, know a whole lot about climate change. But who do we think of as an expert on climate change? And this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about, is like, who gets credit and who do we go to for expertise? So I can kind of like show you a little bit of how this works and what I think is happening. Let me see if I have a I want the image. Okay, this is one of my, what I think is a good example of this. So this is a typical like dialogue, walking around, what Melanie Keene would call familiar science. So just doing science in the everyday domestic spaces, or just walking around your town. So the mom here is talking to her son. They've gone to watch glass blowing. And she says, so they're sort of talking about like what they're watching here. And the son says, by the help of these valuable mathematics, oh, sorry, this is the mom. By the help of these valuable mathematics, my dear, which you see mingle in almost every branch of human industry, but constant practice guides by experience in many things. And the gardener digs his flower beds, and you trundle your hoop and play cricket by the skill of habit without calculating forces and distances, though you obey the unerring laws of nature in such matters. So she's saying, like, look, your play and like the gardener digging, these are all following the laws of nature. But I'm going to point this out to you, and you'll be aware now that there are laws governing these things, and that you can learn that mathematics. And then the boy says, but I shall think a little more now, Mama, and try to figure out the reasons of things. And she says, then you will discover that in most of your active boyish sports, you unconsciously avail yourself of natural laws regulating motion. Oh, shall I? And so he goes on to this. So this is the kind of thing that is happening. So children are being compared analogously to people who are doing mechanical labor. So the word mechanical has two meanings here. It also means people doing physical labor for wages. And the assumption is, by becoming aware of these sort of laws governing their actions, they're going to exit a state of childhood that the laborer never will. So if you don't gain awareness of this, you can't. This is the kind of infantilization of mechanical labor that happens through this. And this is how expertise happens. Like, you know these rules. Now you're above them. You have this kind of mechanical literacy. So this is what I was trying to get at.
Yeah. Oh, sure. All right. And what surprised you most about your findings? I mean, maybe you weren't surprised. I don't know, but were you surprised in delving into the technological education across these divisions of age, gender, and social class?
Yeah. I mean, well, at different points, I've been surprised by different things. I mean, at first, I just didn't even know what I was going to find. I mean, I started reading Edgeworth, and I liked Edgeworth. And then I just was like, what were people learning about, machines at this time? How did they explain that to children? Because she was a children's author, it made me want to know these questions. And that's where I started finding these books about industry, about sort of like touring industrial spaces and so forth. So I was surprised by just how much stuff there is out there. Just like, also, I think how it's many of these nonfiction forms. So this is another way of thinking about the organization of the book, is that several of the chapters study discrete genres of nonfiction that are not named. So we very often just refer to nonfiction as if it's a big dump.
Yeah, it's not fiction, so.
Yeah. But there are certain distinct genres and narrative strategies, and you can trace them back to certain eras. And one of the things that surprised me is that we're still writing the same stuff. When I go to a library, because I teach information books for children, contemporary information books to librarians now at my current job. And when we go to libraries, I can pull out books and be like, aha, I know where this started 200 years ago, this particular strategy for explaining this thing. So just the prevalence of certain metaphors or strategies for explaining certain concepts, they just have enormous staying power over time. It's amazing.
Yeah, the sheer volume, and since I work in a library, what we would, even Mariah Edgeworth, it's kind of thinly veiled information. It's didactic. It's really to a purpose, an educational purpose. It's not reading just for the fun of it,
Yes.
So that, and it's just vast. Yeah, and especially in the United States, there was a lot of questioning, especially in the first half of the 19th century, about whether fiction was even good for children. So didactic fiction would be Okay. Um,
Mhm.
and then, okay, talking about collections, could you discuss your work in the library collections and archives that you used in your research, and how much of your primary research was actually done online? How much of it was done in person? How did you decide which collections to visit? And we heard at the very beginning you received some grants or the
Mhm.
financial support. And what, I mean, did you get your grants all at the beginning or throughout or at the end? And was the bulk of the research done on for this book, was it done while you were a graduate student or as a professor?
Yeah, so it really came in two stages. So the first thing that happened was I had a fellowship to go to the Coatson collection at University of Princeton. And so it's through the Firestone Library Fellowship program that they have there, and then also specifically to see Coatson materials. Um, and I met Andrea Immel, and that whole experience was really formative. That happened during graduate school, I think my fourth year or so. And up until then, I was writing traditional kinds of literature interpretation. I had a dissertation mapped out that was like one author, one chapter, these kinds of things are like, looking at traditional genres, there's more about the novel. And then but I was interested in this kind of like philosophy of mind and how it had to do with sort of like toys, games, material objects, material culture at the time. And by going to that collection, because they had books and toys, I was really able to see it firsthand and see all of this again and again. I just looked at as much as I could. And also, Andrea pointed me to this book, which I brought along today, despite the fact that it's so heavy. Because Jill Sheffrin does a lot of these wonderful collections with Coats and Occasional Press. This one just describes for you like what all of the ephemera, toys, games are and what the proper terminology is. And so this was like my material culture Bible. It came out right at the time that I went out there. And so that also was immensely helpful. They also had like a ton of editions of Edgeworth and some, really important like automata stuff. So I I was able to just figure that out, like figure out that idea. But it was coming late in the dissertation writing. So I wrote a dissertation that was a little wonky. And then when I came back to it as a book, there's a lot of accidents in life. I got hired in a position to teach primarily with librarians and youth services and children's literature rather than British literature. So I kind of refocused. I used to be working with a lot more adult stuff that I exited from the book and just focused on the child materials and just took that archive and re-examined it. And then I went to University of Florida to use the Baldwin collection of historical children's literature. And I met Susan Altieri there. I mean, I have to say, like, I'm not trained as a in bibliographical studies. And so like I really was dependent on these immensely skilled collectors and librarians who were able to kind of show me the ropes and just through their attention to things like editions and printing and just I understood what they were showing me, why they were showing me that its importance and so forth. And so Susan, who now works at University of Illinois here at the Center for Children's Books, she was
Mhm.
she brought out like an enormous cart full of like every science book, every technology book that she could lay her hands on. And it was wonderful because you can browse faster in print. So I was able to browse all these things, zero in on everything. And then I couldn't make any long trips once I was a professor because I was pregnant twice and I had two kids. And so just, I couldn't be away from home for too long. I don't have another adult to care for them while I'm doing this work, so I can't travel with them. So I made these like very quick pit stops. So I'd go into the library and like do a bunch of browsing, a bunch of reading, and I'd always look up all the editions that could be available online. And if there wasn't the right thing, I would concentrate more on those books or take the images that I needed of the select passages. So a lot of it was just documentation in such ways that I could continue to do that work at home as much as I could. And then I also went to University of Cambridge a couple of times. That was just accompanying my partner who had worked there at some point. That was actually during my graduate study. And then another time I was at the Cooperative Archive at Manchester. So they have George Jacob Holyoake's papers, and that was immensely helpful for kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the working class press pushback, because I knew that the cooperative movement would be the place to go to find people who are aware of these education movements and participating in them, but we had connections to working class readers. So yeah, so I went to a lot of different places, I guess. Oh, and I also relied on Lilly Library at University of Indiana, Bloomington. They have really great collection of games. I think it's underused.
Yes.
Yeah, Wisconsin-Madison also has a really good collection of games that's underused.
Yeah, so you really did work internationally and regionally, and was very, and you were very smart about what you needed to look at in person and what you could look at online, and that's really part of the skill now in doing research. So kudos to you, because that you went to really just wonderful places to do this research. And throughout, and it seems like throughout the period that you were working on the book. So it would just, when you start, you have the seed time, you're trying to figure out what you're doing. And then later, when you're really trying to close in and really write, you seem to find the right materials at the right time. And that's a dream come true, isn't it? So back to the book. What gatekeeping measures did you find in these educational texts that serve to exclude girls and working class children from certain types of technological knowledge and skills?
So I think there's a lot of different things. These are really two different questions. I can show the girls' materials really quickly with just how industry was treated. This is a subtle thing. So in the early part of the 19th century, a lot of these books featuring fictional characters who go on tours, who learn about industry, they would have boy and girl characters in the same family, siblings. That tends to separate out after about 1840 or so. You get more books about industry that say they're specifically for boys or specifically for girls. And so there's a different strategy before and after. So before, sometimes the girls sort of separate out and do something different from the boys. They go visit the dairy instead of the forge. Other times, the girls have to prove that they're ready to join this. So many people writing these books do approve of exposing girls, or at least in the way that they're presenting it in the story, to knowledge about industry. But the defense of how you do that requires some kind of conversation. It can't be taken for granted. So like, this one is actually between a mom and a daughter, where the daughter's like, why were you so interested in watching that machinery the other day, Mom? It's super boring, is like the subtext of this. And the mom's like, well, I wish to understand the principle on which the spools and spindles are set in motion, because she's after mechanical literacy. And I wanted to closely observe every part of what you thought so uninteresting. And what use will it be, Mother? And she's like, gives this answer that's like really hilarious to me, where she's like, well, what if I'm at a party and somebody's like, what do you think of this manufacturing business over here? And I don't know anything about it. Wouldn't that be super embarrassing? So there's these really funny like scenarios that are like feminine that they come up with. So here it's like, well, you want to be an informed person who can have a conversation about a topic of the day. This is, I believe, an American author, if I remember correctly. There are other reasons where people are like, basically saying like, the most common one is they have to show that they're tidy, show that they know how to sew and do feminine things already, and then they can go join the boys to learn with the tutor or do the science experiments with the boys, right? So they always have to like show that they're competent in feminine accomplishments in order to have access to this later on. And then the other thing that we see sort of in the Victorian era girls' books are these like conversations in domestic spaces that's used to kind of manage knowledge. It's usually about learning aesthetics and consumption. So a lot of the way that girls are portrayed in these kinds of books is as purchasers. And in domestic spaces. I love this book, Things and Doors. It just always makes me laugh. Just as a title, it's just full basically of objects in your house and tells you information about where they came from. It's like, you know, like a encyclopedia that matches your house. This was a whole thing. Some of these would be organized by room. This one has a like question answer kind of thing. So you could have a conversation if you want with your kid about these things. Again, it tends to include play and work juxtaposed. And then a lot of it is like, if you see the women here, they're usually buying stuff. So I think of this as there's a kind of consumer bargaining around here. If women have a lot of control over purchases, home purchases at the time period. And so this can be used as a way of saying, well, then you need to know the ethics of where things come from. So there's a whole conversation around the woman as the gatekeeper of the homes of the virtuous home. And that is as a way of framing her necessity for learning manufacturing knowledge, or where things come from, because it could come from enslaved labor, it could come from child labor. And she needs to have an opinion on that stuff because it's entering her home, entering her body, being fed to her children, put on the bodies of the people in the home. And so it has this very close, intimate connection with themselves. And I think that's where the Victorian women tend to be sort of given permission to learn this kind of stuff versus the ones that are targeting boys are almost always about like, here's this cool job, get dirty, make a mess. It's much more permissive of failure and experimentation. And much more about industry and sort of masculine strength and sort of ways of thinking about the way that strength and study are interrelated, So as you can see here, I love this frontispiece here.
Okay, wow. And I guess I could hop around, talking about the working class people, towards the end of your book, you describe the work. No, I'm intrigued by your discussion of school teacher cabinet maker William Lovett's descriptions of a movable typecase that features printed letters pasted onto small wooden blocks, which are in turn used to form verbal descriptions of object lessons. So it's like setting type in a way. Do you know whether these typecases, I know you had a reference to it being discussed, right? In a pamphlet, but were they actually ever made or used?
So my sense, and I have not seen one, I mean, this is the sort of thing where if I just had a lot of time on my hands and I could do a lot of deep dives into like preserved small schools, I might be able to find one. However, I have seen similar things. So for instance, at my library at University of Illinois, I know that they have one from around 1870 or so that was produced by the French government for schools that had, again, these little squares that you would set up. So it was a very similar kind of thing. This is an image from that pamphlet showing the invention that William Lovett is suggesting here. What I really like about this is just how odd it is that like in the middle of a pamphlet about like universal male suffrage, William Lovett's like, and this is how you make a toy for teaching children to read, right? So it shows how central this is for him. So I think the way that he talks about it as in use in his school. So even though I don't have a physical thing, I think it's undoubtedly something he personally made. He's a cabinet maker, so he can certainly make stuff. So I think that this is his thing. So he's a cabinet maker and also a journalist and an activist. So like his way of designing this thing is supposed to show children that like from a very young age, when you're learning to read and write, you're learning how to be a printer simultaneously with your letters. And I see this as a commentator or a comment on or a pushback against passive literacy. So at the time period, some schools would only teach children from poor families to read and not teach to write. It's a lot easier to do that too at a time when like pens are harder to use and manipulate, and when there's a pretty big difference between the handwriting used by people and say the printed word that you would learn to read. So here again, what he's making sure is that you get the idea from a very young age that you should express your views to others, and you should express them publicly, because that's something that there's a lot of fear around that, of who has the power to circulate their ideas. And so the idea that working class people should express their own political views and they should print them to instill young children with that from the very time that they're learning to read and write is, to me, like the object of something like this.
Yeah, it's a radical idea. And even now people saying who should be able to vote and who shouldn't and all that. I mean, yeah, it's still this whole idea about literacy and does everybody have equal access to all types of literacy? It's very much an open question. So, John, do we have questions?
That's great. We do. And we only have about a little over 10 minutes left in the hour, so I want to be a little mindful of the clock. Um,
Okay.
we already have one question in the Q&A. Um, uh, I'd be curious to hear what, quote, adult text you were thinking about using and how you were planning to talk about mechanical education as it was directed toward adult audiences. Given that your research focused on on children's literature, what differences did you notice in how mechanical literacy appeared in texts for children, the children's books, or perhaps even games themselves, and texts directed to adults, as in novels, writing on education, advertisements, that type of thing?
Yeah, so I think it was just a very different project when I was first writing this. So I kind of came to the idea of mechanical literacy at the very end as a way of thinking about what I was getting at. And so really, when I wrote my dissertation, which is also out there, it's much more about the way that fiction itself can help you understand causality of the mind. I mean, there's other scholars who've written on this now as well. But I was interested in the way that mental like storylines that are in novels, they depend on people sort of understanding the logic or the motivations of other characters, and that way of thinking about things was part of a kind of nascent philosophy of mind that's behind a lot of radical thought. The idea that human beings make choices in predictable sorts of ways, and you can have a kind of social study of human behavior that would enable you to devise a new education system that is appropriate for the kind of society you want to have. So if you want a democratic society, if you want a more socialist society, you can figure out how to mold people through the right kinds of narratives, the right kind of motives, and that fiction has a place in that because fiction helps people understand motive and action. So that was much more what I was thinking about. And that came out of reading a lot of William Godwin, especially Caleb Williams. That was like, I mean, that is like his whole thing. And then I could kind of see how that played out in that's very popular idea in 1790s radical texts, but it sort of trickles through to other kinds of educators later on. So.
Okay, thank you. For other people watching the webinar, please, if you have any questions, pop them into the Q&A. In the final little bit that we have left, Liz, like looking at your screen and seeing like all the images kind of scrolling by that you have here, I'm very intrigued with like the material side of this. Is there, a book or object or two that was sort of like the linchpins for when you were seeing them and you ran across in the library, you were like, oh, this is like everything just falls into place with,
Yeah.
we're all looking for like that one unicorn piece that's gonna,
Yes.
solve all
Yeah.
problems for us.
So I have some favorites. Yeah, but I'm going to go with Moody just because he's so little known and because this was such a funny picture.
He deserves to be known.
Yeah, so I found this at Coates. I didn't know who George Moody was. I thought it was fascinating because it's a grammar that has like a grammar book attached to a case. There's a whole tradition that I had been looking at of understanding the mind as a container. You learn knowledge, learn reading by putting your letters into that container. So these sort of the invention of things like, sorry, I have to go way back here, but like alphabet tiles, sort of the storage containers used for both games and letters. Very often people play games where as you learn material, you put it into an envelope, sort of concretizing the way the mind contains knowledge. So when I first saw this, that's what I thought it was. But then on the way to Cooperative Society or Cooperative Archives of Manchester, I was reading more working class history and something mentioned George Moody, just like a name drop. And I just happened to remember because I'd written about it enough. It's this guy, he's a radical journalist. And then I did a deep dive to find out like what was he thinking. And at that archive, there was a letter from George Moody to Robert Owen, sort of like guy who started British socialism, being like, I'm going to use manipulatives, like little wooden bits of wood, and I'm going around these taverns talking to workers to explain the way that economics works. And he's using them to represent like sort of, I don't know, the equivalent of the GDP. He's using like economics reports of the time, and he's representing them with these little physical blocks to show that the wealth is being produced mainly by workers and spent mainly by wealthy people. And he's making this argument by making it very physical so people can see that. So what it made me understand is that he actually got his whole training in material thinking through this kind of how to communicate to everyday people. And he didn't get it the other way around. He's just aware of it. And so what he did is he fused two traditions. He took the sort of playful learning tradition used for teaching, middle class girls and boys. And then he took this sort of like ironic materialist thinking of the working class radicals, and he brought them together. And I just thought that was so cool. So like his way of doing this is like, everything's color coded according to the parts of speech. So he's teaching you sort of the basics of grammar. That's an idea that comes from another grammar book that was published. I have like the Rainbow Grammar.
Yeah, it's there. I saw it.
Yeah, I know. Raise, there it is. There it is. It comes from this book by Eliza Fenwick, where she had children sort of color in. You would get like a blank copy plus a colored copy to learn your grammar that way. So this was something that was already out there. I think he may have known about that now. But then he combines it with his experience. And it was actually, it was reviewed. I thought this was hilarious, like in the Northern Star, which is, or in Richard Ostley's The Fleet Paper, next to Richard Ostley's The Fleet Papers in the Northern Star. So this is like a Chartist newspaper is like reviewing this grammar. And their review of it is like also hilarious because they're like, he simplifies grammar, but he should really do away with all grammatical rules whatsoever. So they have this like, they're clearly seeing grammatical laws as a kind of equivalent of governing systems, and also the accessibility that you have to write for in your own style, because insistence that you have to learn some kind of complicated system or write for the public, again, is a barrier. So it's a barrier to being able to express your ideas in public. So I was like really fascinated by this. And when I realized that, and then when I ran into other grammars that did similar kinds of work by Holyoake, this is what became that final chapter on grammars, with the William Lovett case as well. So I saw like a number of different people who are doing sort of like what we would see as pedagogy of the oppressed kind of work.
Yeah.
It was like, pushing back against what it means to learn to read.
Nice. And a comment in the chat from Andrea Immel, to not forget trotting tutoress Goody Two Shoes and her cut alphabet tiles, teaching children to read through what sounds like a Scrabble game, but
yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, she's such a great example. And she also invents a barometer. So one of the things that I bring her up early in the book because she does those two things. And again, she's both a rational scientist and a reader. And they're so often hands in hand. If you can do one, if you can organize your letters, you can organize and understand the weather and other sorts of things.
The basis of so much. If I can, not being someone who works on anything near this modern, in terms of the books being addressed to children, even the ones that mention boys, girls. Um, I always just wonder about this with terms of like adult literacy. Is there evidence that, you know, not children were reading children's books in order just to be educated, adults learning to read rather in the workhouse or the home?
Yeah.
Like, what is the real audience for children's books?
Yeah, that's a really good and important question. And I'm going to see if I have, I'm trying to remember if I have the, an example of this, because I just saw it when I was putting all this together. So I just have to do like a very quick. Okay, this is it. So this is George Moody's grammar. This is from the Coates-in copy. I pulled this up last minute, so apologies for it being kind of messy because this is not one that I asked to show in the book. But it has, for the use of schools or private families and of adults whose knowledge of grammar may be defective, who may speedily become self-instructed with the aid of this work. So often reviews of grammar books will also mention this. They'll say, mothers who have not learned grammar themselves may use this toy to learn grammar while they are instructing their children. So that sometimes it addresses mothers that way. That's a common thing. The other, in this case, I think Moody is also, he's pointing out that adults may learn this too, so they could learn with children. Yeah. So so one of the things I think of though is like, what tradition is it coming from here? And I think it's coming from two traditions, the teaching of adults that he had experience with that with economics, but then also this reference to easy and amusing means it's coming from also this idea of play. But there's a lot of work metaphors to it. And those work metaphors are sometimes interpreted by scholars as meaning it must be for adults. But one of the things that I've really pushed back against in my own thinking and writing is that children worked too. And there's this group of children who are like 10 to 18 years old that are, the vast majority of working class children were working by age 10. So if they want to further their schooling, they have to get a hold of some kind of books like this or share them with people. And so a lot of the grammars were written to be learned more quickly and more efficiently by not requiring you to have complicated systems, not requiring you to know Latinate terminology or anything about Latin, not requiring memorization, but just practice exercises. And that the idea was that was easier for you to do if you just finished a really long shift and you're like 12, So yeah, so you can see this, that they really are targeting both.
Right. I mean, and in the United States, there was not a compulsory education law for children until the early 20th century. So this whole idea of children going to school, universal compulsory education for children, is a relatively new idea.
Wow. I have one more question that a colleague texted into me. It seems that many of these objects are fairly class-based, either to help privileged children observe and learn mechanical literacy, or for working class children to gain some basic language literacy. Are there any materials that show like cross-class communication or play?
Yeah, there are. So I think this is actually probably an example of one. I think this one, it's reviewed as being used by mothers with children. I would guess that that is more of a anticipated middle class use. But Moody also uses there's like a lot of Easter egg private jokes in here that if you know radical satirical literature, you're going to catch on to. It's hard to explain, but he has this whole introduction about how people make grammar way too complicated, and it has lots of Latinate words in it, TION words and stuff like that. That was often used as a poke against sort of the gentleman's learning in the radical press at the time. So sometimes two people may read the text and get two different meanings from it if they're in the know. Another example of this is I think Holyoke is in this space as well, really, like, because some of these, if you're writing in these working class spaces, like a lot of times these are by people who they're on the edge of the more educated artisanal class. I mean, that's how they're able to gain enough literacy to like then become a publisher. They're very often on the edge. And some of these cooperative movement figures were trying to foster cross-class relationships. They would, and I saw in a lot of their journals, for instance, they would have groupings that they would call together people purposely and be like, we want people who are workers and middle-class people to come together and come to this meeting. They would like have sort of picnics together, purposeful mixing of perspectives. This was the idea that we're going to like work together. So yeah, so I think that some of these materials appealed across class and were part of a kind of shared politics or a shared movement there, especially among the cooperators.
Okay. Kind of related to that as well, and this is more of a like thing that I deal with in the Renaissance. Are there editions of children's books that seem to be printed for a specific class? Like you have um, copies of a work with the illustrations in color, and then a copy that's in just
Yeah.
black and white, like ostensibly at a different price point.
Hmm. Yeah. So sometimes copies of the same book survive that have coloring in them, like hand painted coloring that would have cost more. Because you were paying somebody to do that work. So, and then also children's books sometimes could be sold not like by peddlers, not folded up, but just as a flat sheet, so
Oh.
that then the person purchasing them would fold them up and sew the binding, and that would be a way of getting like the ultimate cheapest version of it because you're not paying somebody to do that binding work for you. So there's a couple different ideas. And then the last one that's like the cheapest, I think, is excerpting. So a lot of like cheap journalist papers that were part of the radical press, they would take bits of poetry or songs that had caught on, or bits from Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, and published those bits that they thought were interesting, so that you could just buy your newspaper from the week. It might have a mix of political commentary plus excerpts from these other works that maybe you wouldn't be able to afford the whole thing.
Amazing to think just of how like the market is always and like commercial options, from
Yeah.
when, at least in the European Western world, from when printing began, that was
Mhm.
always an option.
Yeah.
It's amazing how that just carries all the way through.
Yeah. I mean, I forgot too to mention too, like in a lot of schools, some children bought a whole book to learn from. Other children used more of the Lancastrian card approach, where you would have card lessons hung on the wall and then people could access simultaneously one page in a book. So if you think about that, like it's an invention for making learning cheaper, is to imagine the book unbound and then paste it onto the wall across the wall. That way, nobody has to buy the book. You just gather around the lesson that you are at. So that was another way that they did that.
Yeah, in the United States after the Civil War, the American Tract Society came out with a book like a primer, and then the same text was also printed on large cards, on large like broadsides that would be put up around a large hall for recently freed people and impoverished white people as well from the South, for them all to learn how to read.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great example. Yeah, like that style. And the this this here that I had showed before, the example of William Lovett's cabinet that he creates. Sorry, wherever I put it, I lost it now. When I showed you the William Lovett's cabinet,
Yeah.
he mentions that you could also do that with stands around the room. So this was a
Mhm.
strategy also
Okay.
used at the time. The reason for that is that you can also put up other things other than just the cards. You can put up pictures of stuff, you can put up objects or display cases holding specimens. So you could have the children move around the room. And then it's also supposed to help when you have young kids who are pretty restless, that the movement between the stations is helping them kind of like not have to sit at their desk the whole time.
I just was like flashing back to school science fairs and things.
Yeah.
We are a couple of minutes after the hour, and the Q&A seems to have gone a little bit quiet. So,
Okay.
um,
That's
just to
okay.
be wary of everyone's time,
Yep.
we may call it there. I want to thank both Liz and Laura for sharing this material with us, leading us through this discussion, and looking at some wonderful material aspects of literacy and learning from the 19th century. Thank you all for supporting the Bibliographical Society of America. And remember, if you are able, to please consider donating through the link that was in the chat or our website. And you can either get our fantastic blank book journals or be part of a donation, a matching grant donation that will help us achieve some of our returning, help us match, help us to meet our end of year financial goals. And if it is possible, is are there any kind of like final resources you might be able to share with
Oh,
the
sorry.
viewers?
Just realized that I was bringing that up where you can see it.
If
Um,
there's
yes. So I'll just mention that there's a compendium to the book if you're interested. It's online and it's accessible for free. It's through Manifold, which is the the digital sort of publishing system that is used for this. So it's just to give additional images. So that the black and white images in the book, I did not include here, unfortunately. But they do have a lot of other ones that I couldn't get in, and they're all many of them are also linked to the libraries that they came from and so forth. So you can go back and see even more from those books if you want to. So it's a great
That's
way to like
amazing.
browse stuff that's related to the book.
Yeah, what a great resource. Okay. Thank you all very much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Laura, again. And everyone, have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you so much.